this is a week which we in Latvia call Week of Patriots, between November 11, March Diena, and November 18, the Day of Independence, which is a week where we, Latvian society, are reminded that freedom is something that cannot be taken for granted. It's something you have to fight for, and I think therefore it's a really very appropriate time to remember and to speak about those who have been fighting with us and for us. We know it's been a long time under the rule of Soviet Union, and we know there was diaspora, Latvian diaspora, who fought really hard both in Europe, in the United States, in all countries, to remind the countries, the powers, the Western powers, that Latvia should be considered, it is an occupied state, and we were not alone in our fight. One of those people, one of those persons who helped us was Otto von Habsburg, and I think therefore it's a really perfect opportunity, specifically in this week, to talk about his legacy, and I'm really pleased that we can host this event. So thank you for coming.
Your Excellency, former President of Latvia, Dr. Levits, Archbishop Zbigniew Stankiewicz, Excellencies, Ambassador colleagues, your State Secretary, Director, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you to this seminar. I'm very grateful that we can commemorate a great European person today. And I'm very thankful also to the University of Latvia for hosting this event and for our excellent cooperation in this commemoration. But maybe it is a little bit more than commemoration, simply because we would also like to pay tribute to the achievements of Otto von Habsburg. I think when we started the event a little bit more than an hour ago in the Sveta Jakaba Cathedral here in Riga, with a commemoration and Thanksgiving Holy Mass celebrated by Archbishop Stankiewicz. And he mentioned a very important feature also from the life of Otto von Habsburg, which I think worthwhile presenting also during this seminar to you, who were not all of you there, but thank you to everyone who were there. And this feature is that Otto von Habsburg lived a very fruitful life. His life was filled with fruits of the Holy Spirit, and his life was a fruitful life that he produced a lot to remember afterwards. And one of these elements of the fruit of the life, which the Archbishop singled out, was that in the sense of what we have heard from the Gospel of John from the 15th chapter, that he produced this fruit with a close connection to God. This was a very vivid element of his life, and he produced fruit not only in spiritual realm, but also in the political life. And one of those elements of the fruit is, I think, which is perhaps less widely known here in Latvia, and we contribute to make this element perhaps a little bit more widespreadly known here today, is that he stood up for the independence of the Baltic States at those times when it might have looked a little bit hopeless case. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, when you know it much better than me what was the situation here in the Baltic States, but there was a great European who stood up for Baltic independence, and we will learn more about today how and what and when exactly. But as Otto himself said, he considered himself a European. For the difference between a Greek and an Irishman, a Portuguese and a Danish person is smaller than the factors that unite us, and these factors are the common European culture and the common European liberty. And this is one of the reasons that the Embassy of Hungary started organizing this event today, because Hungary serves as the presidency of the Council of the European Union until the end of December this year, and we consider that showcasing the best examples from European history is something worthwhile, not only remembering but also drawing the lessons from. So we are very much honored by the presence and contribution of His Excellency former President of Latvia, Dr. Egils Levits. He will be our first speaker today, but before giving him the floor, I think we have yet another opening address. So thank you for coming and being here with us today. Thank you.
Yes, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, researchers, and I also would like to say students, because I saw some of the students also in the auditorium. On behalf of the University of Latvia, and especially on behalf of the Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences, that faculty that prepared future political scientists, I'm very happy to host an event here in that building, because in political science sometimes we discuss a lot what independence is. And of course, I'm not going to discuss this from the political science perspective, that might be a bit maybe boring, but let's look on the independence quickly from another perspective. If we assume that independence is just a noun, it's static. It's accepted as granted. It's here. It's a phenomenon that's here to stay. But if we look on independence as a verb, then it requires action to protect, to safeguard, to do certain activities. And I suppose Otto von Habsburg was that person who really perceived independence, European integration, as a verb, as something that we could create if we really believe in that idea. So I wish you a fruitful and inspiring debates, discussions. Let it inspire us all to keep and safeguard our independence and independence of Europe and the idea of Europe. And of course, I suppose since I'm the last one giving a welcoming speech, I would like to welcome His Excellency former President of Latvia, Mr. Egils Levits, to give his speech on title of the European Parliament's resolution on Baltic States of 1983 and the role of Otto von Habsburg as a driving force behind the adoption of this resolution. Mr. Levits, the floor is yours.
Ambassador Habsburg, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this event, which is organized by Hungarian ambassador on the occasion of the presidency of the European Union. I should say that I just yesterday came back from Budapest. I gave two lectures there in Budapest and in Pécs. And I would say that today we are commemorating a great European personality, but I will highlight only one aspect of his work, his life. His life covers quite the whole 20th century, 99 years from 1912 to 1912 to 2011, also quite 100 years. And during this 100 years, the whole map of Europe and of the world changed completely. We have Otto von Habsburg was at the center of the revolutions of and the First World War, when the four continental empires crashed down: Austria-Hungary, Russia, Germany, German Empire, and Turkish Empire, and a lot of new states arrived, also including, of course, Latvia, including Austria, including Hungary. He was the last crown prince of Austria-Hungary, and in the age of 4, so at the started life as a crown prince, but of course the world map, European map, developed otherwise. So it's also interesting part of his history that he was for a long time forbidden by law, by constitution of Austria to enter Austria. And there was other restrictions. And only in the 60s this case was solved. But anyway, he was a patriot of Austria, of Hungary, of all the empire, but I would say, in the first case, a patriot of Europe. He was president of a pan-European movement, which was founded 1930s, and it was a movement which wanted to have a unified Europe. I would say the idea before the European Union arose, it was already in the 30s. And he, in the 70s, he became president of this movement, of course, and his familial background was exact the right background to do that. But I will say to you only some words on my personal impression with my connection and relations with Otto von Habsburg. And Otto von Habsburg and the Baltic States. You know that the Baltic States were occupied and annexed in 1940, exact in the same time as a lot of others. European states were occupied by Germans or by Russians. And in May 1940, for example, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg were occupied, Poland already before, and the first expansion of Germany was Austria, 1938, Anschluss. But in 1945, all of the other states, which I mentioned, Norway and Denmark and Austria and so on, were liberated and became independent again, but they were not new states. There was no new Austria, no new Poland, or no new Netherlands, because it was a case, legal case, political case of state continuation, despite the occupation and annexation. And the same situation was also in the Baltic States, but in difference from the other states which were occupied and annexed in 1940, by us lasted, it is not 5 years, but 50 years. But from legal point of view, there is no difference. And of course, it is necessary to maintain this legal continuity, despite the real occupation, the real annexation. And this was done by the Western countries which have not recognized legally recognized the occupation and annexation. Of course, you see also today by the case of Ukraine, that there are also in Western society some voices which are saying Ukraine, you should give up some part of territory while you are trying to resist to that. Such voices were also after the Second World War in many Western countries, which said it is not worth to maintain this politics of non-recognition because it is no hope for getting independent again for the Baltic States. But because also the Latvian and Estonian and Lithuanian exiles, which were very strong and very good organized, they have pushed the governments to maintain this politics of non-recognition, and in a specific, very unique case in Australia, the government recognized the occupation of Baltic States. The Baltic exiles organized political demonstrations and pressure to the government, so the government took back this recognition of the annexation. It's a unique case in the history, there was no other. But anyway, in international law, each case makes precedent, and this is also the precedent. The precedent means that at least 50 years of occupation does not lead to the legal extinction of a state. At least 50 years. So, maybe after 100 years, we don't know, but 50 years, it's for sure. There is also, after the Baltic States, only one precedent. This is the precedent of East Timor. East Timor became independent in 1974 from Portugal. And 2 weeks after the independence, Indonesia invaded East Timor, deported part of the population, and sent Indonesian colonists to East Timor. But because of this case was non-recognized and because of this political pressure to Indonesia from international community, 2001, also that means 27 years later, Indonesia left East Timor. This is the second precedent. Also, but for international law, the first precedent was the Baltic States. Okay, this is a legal background. And in order to maintain this politics of non-recognition, constant pressure was necessary. And the constant pressure was done in different ways by with the politics, but also one of the ways was to obtain legal statements of the states, or like here by the European Parliament. The deputies of Parliament of many Western states regularly asked the government, do you still have recognizing that the Baltic states are independent states? And each time the government ministers answered, yes, we are still recognizing that, and Baltic states are not part of the Soviet Union. And this was, so to say, constant tactic in many Western European and Western countries, or in the US and so on. There was also official statements of US presidents, different presidents in different occasions and so on. But the European Union, and at the time it was European Community, has not gave a statement till now. And therefore, there was an idea that also the European Union, as a new subject of international laws, should give the appreciation, formal, legal and political appreciation of the situation in the Baltic states. Since 1979, there was a first direct elections of the European Parliament. Before that, it was indirect elections. Since 1979, first direct elections, And also Ambassador Habsburg maybe will tell you that Otto von Habsburg was elected in respect of Germany in the European Parliament. 1980, the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian exiles had a good relations with some deputies, British deputies, because there was a big Latvian exile communities, and they started to prepare a resolution. But the resolution was, I would say, not very strong, this draft. But then Otto von Habsburg was elected in the political committee of the parliament, and the political committee decided that Otto von Habsburg should be the rapporteur, one of the deputies, was the rapporteurs for the resolutions, and he became the rapporteur. Then, in the same time, he understood that it is necessary to have a big coalition of all political forces in order to get this and to get strong resolution. And he approached the German deputy Zehler. Zehler was a deputy from Hamburg. And Zehler was approached by Otto von Habsburg, and Zehler asked someone, he was a social democrat, a lawyer, and whether there is a representative of the Baltics who can help him to prepare this resolution, and on this way he came to me, because I was just have just finished my studies of law in the university, and so we came together with Zehler to Habsburg in Strasbourg, and then we wanted to have a much more stronger resolution. And I think together, Habsburg and Zehler, but also I have also contributed to the text, we have drafted a very strong text, and in this way it was unique, and I will say why. This text has several points which no other such kind of resolutions had. First of all, they mentioned as a ground the memorandum of 45 Baltic dissidents from 1979, which were published in the West, and the 45 dissidents asked for independence and against russification. Also, this one direct link to the situation in the Baltic States. Then it was just 1975, the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe were held, and there was a general act of this conference, and this act provides for some human rights part of this general act. And this was an interesting tactic of Soviet and Eastern European, Polish, but also these 45 Baltic dissidents to rely on these human rights in order to ask Soviet Union has signed this act. Also, we are not against the Soviet Union, but we have only asked for execution, for fulfilling this human rights. And therefore also this reference to this human rights part of this conference general act. Then I think the most, and till now the only unique part of the resolution was because at the time, 1972, there was a secret act of the Soviet government to start general Russification of all non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union, including Baltic States. And therefore, we decided that we should approach this issue because it was not approached by, for example, other governments, this problem of Russification and colonization. And then we asked how we can approach that. And it was the idea of Otto von Habsburg to say the best is also to combine this material question with procedural question. That means to ask the European governments to bring the question of the Baltic States before the Decolonization Committee of the United Nations. And if you are bringing this case to the Decolonization Committee of United Nations, of course that means they are colonies. And till now, this problem of Soviet colonialism was not approached by any Western government, colonialism. It was fundamental rights, annexation, occupation, but colonialism, because colonialism means more than only occupation and annexation. It means deportation of part of the population to Russia and sending own citizens, Russians, to the Baltic States. And it was also mentioned by the preamble of the resolution that 665,000 people from Baltic States were deported, and many people from Soviet Union were brought in order to colonize the Baltic States. Also, in many ways, it was a very radical solution. I remember maybe 5-6 times I went to Strasbourg to meet Otto von Habsburg, and we had a very good discussions, and he said that this is the occasion. We should be so radical as possible. And in this resolution, if you are reading that, it's all what is necessary is here, is in one resolution. But of course, we drafted this resolution maybe several months. I went there for several times, sometimes together with the deputy sailor from Hamburg, because I lived also in Hamburg at the time, but sometimes alone. And the draft was ready, and then of course it was up to Otto von Habsburg to bring forward through the parliamentarian deliberations, and together with Zeller, because it was very important, because Zeller represented the left side of the parliament. He was on the right side of the parliament, and both together convinced the majority of deputies to support the resolution. At the end, 99 deputies voted for, from left and from the right, and 6 again, and 7 abstentions. The 6 again, there was Greek communists. And interesting also the deliberation in the plenary session. Also, there was a very good speech of Otto von Habsburg. He covered all the case. There was a good speech, I said very good, from Otto von Habsburg, good speech from Zeller, and also good speeches from other deputies. There was very good speech again from a Greek communist deputy, and some also his party members, Greek communists. The Greek communists were at the time Orthodox communists, because you know that the French and Italian communists were so-called Euro-communists, and they abstained. The Euro-communists were not against, but also, of course, not for.
Thank you very much, Excellency. It was very interesting to hear your approach, which was at the same time a personal one, an approach of an international lawyer, a historian, a political scientist, so everything combined. I think all very much enjoyed it. And in this way, it might have been just like we will break it down to more detail with the help of the next speakers. because we will have now a contribution from the point of view of a historian serving for the Habsburg Otto Foundation in Budapest, and then we will have a family member of the Habsburg family as well, serving as the ambassador of Hungary to the Holy See right now. And before giving the floor to Mr. Bence Kocsev, who is this historian, graduate of the Budapest Eötvös Loránd University, I perhaps have a word or two about why exactly the Habsburg Otto Foundation exists in Budapest, because we have figured out and stated that Otto von Habsburg was a great European, that's true, but with a Hungarian heart. And he demonstrated this by the sheer fact that his final will was that his heart should be buried in Hungary. And it is so. He might have been the very first Habsburg to come up with such a final will to his heart be buried in Hungary, because the body is in Vienna, in the Kapuzinerkirche, because this is the traditional Habsburg burial place, but the heart is in Hungary, and also the legacy. The correspondence, and this is a huge correspondence, and this is handled and managed by the Otto von Habsburg Foundation in Budapest, and that is why I'm so happy to give the floor to the research fellow of this foundation, Mr. Bence Kocsev now. Thank you.
Excellencies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. It's both an honor and a pleasure for me to be here and represent the Otto von Habsburg Foundation. My pensum today is to examine Otto von Habsburg's engagements or efforts or advocacy for the Baltic States. I'm in a difficult position because President Levits already covered this topic, so I'm trying to complement the story a little bit. I'm going to start from a bit of a distance to provide some context, but I promise I will get to the heart of the matter later on. And speaking of hearts, I must give a small disclaimer. I'm just the humble substitution of the director of the foundation, Gergely Pröhle, who was originally scheduled for this speak, but unfortunately he's going to give a keynote speech at the already mentioned Pannonhalma Archabbey, where the heart of Otto von Habsburg is also kept and was an important site and institutions for Otto von Habsburg for his whole life. Nevertheless, the topic has a certain actuality. It was also mentioned by President Levits that this year marks the 45th anniversary of the first direct elections to the European Parliament, in which Otto von Habsburg was elected as a member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Christian Social Union of Bavaria, so representing Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany back then. And as a member of the European Parliament, his key contributions centered around his commitment to Central and Eastern Europe, including, of course, the Baltic countries, first in their struggles to free themselves from a communist yoke, and then later on in supporting their journey towards the European Union. But, and this is an important but, he became involved with the Baltic cause or with the Baltic question much earlier than 1974, as he played a key role in advocating the interest of these countries during the earlier phases of the Cold War as well. He used his extensive networks across Europe and globally to bring attention to the struggles of the Baltic nations under Soviet rule, and to challenge Soviet narratives for any territorial claim in the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea. So what were these networks with which he tried to raise awareness to the Baltic cause? Otto von Habsburg, it was already mentioned, was a networker par excellence. So he got a huge and very interesting network. He possessed all the qualities which were necessary to build up such a huge network. He was hardworking, dedicated, he had a visionary thinking, and had a personal charisma in the true Max Weberian sense of the word. I guess Ambassador Habsburg will tell more about that. So he was already well connected in the 1930s, and you can see a quote, presumably from President Roosevelt, who told his chief of staff, I tell you, the two people who are best informed about Europe are the Pope and Archduke Otto. I have some doubts about the realness of this quote, but he nevertheless made a good impression on the US president. And it was during the Second World War when Otto von Habsburg first met some of the exiled politicians and diplomats from the Baltic States in the United States and later on in the United Kingdom. I'm not going to go into detail in these various layers. I just want to speak a little bit about the anti-communist and conservative connections of Otto von Habsburg, which were seminal in putting forward this Baltic issue, and these were the most important networks of Otto von Habsburg during the first period of the Cold War. So these networks initially was established as a reaction to the Cold War and the division of Europe, with the primary mission to oppose communism, which they perceived as something against the principles of das christliche Abendland, so the Christian West. These were the CDSS, the ZEDI, it was the biggest one and probably the most important for Otto, the Le Cercle, which was the most influential within Europe, and the Institute in Liechtenstein, which in a different form but still existing today. And these organizations were actively engaged with European integration, transatlantic relations, but also played a great role in dealing with minority issues. And these were kind of transnational hubs, spaces of interaction, as I put on the slides, which operated behind official foreign policy, but yet they were able to exert some considerable influence on certain decisions. And Otto von Habsburg understood the fight against communism not just a European thing, but as a global struggle, and invited guests to these circles from all over the world. You can see on the right picture Seigen Tanaka, who initially was a communist politician in Japan, transferred into the conservative, so to say, matchmaker or shadow politician, who was very much involved in many of the issues which kept Otto von Habsburg busy. And the other is a letter which Otto von Habsburg sent to Henry Kissinger. We have the correspondence at the foundation between Kissinger and Otto von Habsburg, more than 500 pages, very interesting. They mostly dealt with European issues in these letters. And what is really interesting in this case, that these circles or these networks were the first fora what Otto von Habsburg used to raise awareness for the Baltic cause in Europe and worldwide. And the interesting thing in this is that the Baltic exiled and dissident organizations were very much involved in the work of these networks. So, for instance, the Baltische Gesellschaft in Deutschland, which originally was founded as an organization for expelled and resettled Baltic Germans, but later evolved into an influential interest group for the broader Baltic cause. So these circles and this Baltic interest group was closely tied. The other organization Otto von Habsburg used to further the Baltic cause was the already mentioned Pan-European movement or Union, which was founded by Coudenhove-Kalergi, and it was already him who regarded the Baltic states in the early 20s as integral parts of Europe. he said, die Ostgrenze Europas wird nun durch die politische Grenze zwischen Russland und den demokratischen Randstaaten bestimmt. So the eastern boundary of Europe is now defined by the political border between Russia and the democratic border states, so these Baltic states. We can endlessly talk about Rudolf Kalergi and his vision as well, but today it is more important that in 1973 Otto von Habsburg took over the international presidency of the Pan-European movement, and he transferred the whole movement into mass organizations. Before that, it was, let's phrase it this way, a contemplative project, and he was able to make it a mass movement, dealing of course, with European integration, but also with the issue of expat communities, so most notably Sudeten Germans, but also oppressed nationalities and minorities. And in this context, the Pan-European Union played an important role in advocating for the Baltic cause during the second half of the 20th century. And through this platform, Otto championed the Baltics' rights to self-determination and positioned their struggle within the larger vision of a free and united Europe. Journals and papers were also important platforms to convey his ideas, also with regard to the Baltic cause. And one of his writings, which was published in 1966, entitled The Effects of Communism on the Cultural and Psychological Politics in Eastern Europe, and was published by the Intercollegiate Review at the request of Edwin Fellner, the founding president of the notable Heritage Foundation, a main think tank behind the Reagan administration and still now an influential think tank. So Americans already perceived Otto von Habsburg visions on a united Europe as a source of inspiration that despite the current situation, the Soviet Union will not survive. And this is really an interesting publication of Otto von Habsburg. I quote, the moral deficiencies of communism are compounded by structural challenges and economic shortcomings. These long-term problems of the communist power prove that Marxism, despite the external appearances, is fighting against the clock. Already in 1966, he was sure that the Soviet Union will disintegrate and fall apart. But the most important, the most important forum for Otto von Habsburg to further the Baltic cause was the already mentioned European Parliament. He became member of the European Parliament in 1979 and remained there for 20 years, and he considered this as a divinely appointed opportunity and used it very wisely. So you can see here, I thank God that I am a member of the European Parliament. This was his answer to a question of a newspaper, whether he regrets not being an emperor. He said, okay, but I thank God that I'm a member of the European Parliament, and he considered it as a very useful mission. This is a letter sent to Friedrich August von Hayek, the Nobel Prize laureate economist, and he said in this letter, man hat wenigstens das Gefühl, in einem nützlichen Einsatz zu stehen, so one has the feeling in an important mission, to be in an important or a useful mission. He was a very versatile politician, as it was mentioned by President Levitz, dealing with a lot of issues, from security politics to economic issues to environmental protection. Nevertheless, he was most remembered for his pivotal role in advocating for the independence of Central Eastern European countries. From 1979, he consciously used this political platform to raise awareness to the nations under the Soviet rule, and as a token, in the early 1980s, together with Adam Ferguson, the man on the right picture, they set up an empty chair in the European Parliament to represent the countries that are under the Soviet rule. And in addition, in the early 1980s, together with the same Adam Ferguson and with the Danish Niels Hagerup, they were informally known as the Gang of Three within the Political Affairs Committee. They presented a motion to the European Parliament, further advocating for the Baltic States' cause and reinforcing their struggle for sovereignty and recognition. But President Levits has already covered this topic. And this is a quote from him about the various meetings of the European Parliament and the various committees. He also wrote summaries for the members of the Pan-European movement, and this is a quote from this summary. And the last sentence of this is, it was encouraging that a number of social democrats from Germany, France and Italy voted for the proposal. The debate was a very high standard and, as far as I can tell, left a strong impression as evidenced by the press coverage. So this was this Hans-Joachim Seeler, if I remember correctly his name, with whom he managed to pass this motion. And, as it was mentioned, he consciously tied the issue to the broader question of decolonization, ensuring that left-wing parties could not vote against it. Yes, and some documents from our archives. During the Cold War, he was already in contact with two Baltic dissidents organizations worldwide, so the various Baltic legations, which were missions of the exiled Baltic diplomatic services or corps from 1940 to 1991, which maintained their country's legations in several Western European and US, Western European capitals and in Washington as well. Later on, Otto von Habsburg also supported various initiatives within the European Parliament to provide financial aid to the Baltic states, focusing on securing European Union funding and support programs to enhance the economies, infrastructures, and democratic institutions of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This financial assistance was probably very vital to facilitate that transition. And following these are further examples from the Cold War period, early 1980s. These two, the Baltic World Council and the Baltische Gesellschaft in Deutschland. But after the Cold War, he remained in close connections with many of the new leaders of the Baltic countries, and made multiple visits to these states. And these are also documents from our collections, correspondence with Vaira Vike Freiberga and Vytautas Landsbergis. And in a paper on the Eastern enlargement of the European Union, he concluded that one can expect Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to become one of the Union's most respected partners, anticipating that their integration would strengthen the Union and enhance its collective status and effectiveness on the global stage. And with these words, I'd like to thank for your attention and wish you a fruitful rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
This is one of the conferences where it gets more and more difficult after each speaker to say something interesting and new, because so many great things already have been said about Otto von Habsburg, and we are getting a feeling of an incredible personality that played a real strong role in the coming together of Europe over decades. So I'm going to contribute a bit of a personal relationship, because I'm going to talk about what it meant to grow up under Otto von Habsburg as a member of the Habsburg family, and how that shaped our idea of Europe, because it did very strongly. Otto was a giant for all of us. We adored him. He was the head of our family, and we knew he was great. He was incredibly friendly and gentle with everybody. So what you perhaps, if you just flew over those letters, this incredible humble, gentle, and taking everyone serious style that he even had with children. I remember when I asked him a question, it must have been a really stupid question because I was rather young, he would bow down and say, "Yes, you know, my dear, I'm going to tell you what I think about it, but it's a very good question that you put to me, thank you very much." You felt so important, he did that all the time. So I knew him for decades, really. We had many conversations, and you know, what you just heard me doing is imitating his accent. He spoke an old-fashioned aristocratic Viennese from the beginning of the 20th century. Because of the mixture of his father and his mother influencing his German, and that always reminded us that this giant goes back so far. There is a famous picture which you can see, I suppose, somewhere over there, where you see him standing with his hand on the knee of Emperor Franz Joseph. And I knew this elderly gentleman over there has met Emperor Francis Joseph. That was absolutely awe-inspiring for us. I'm going to give you a few quotes that every one of us knew by heart. The most important quote of Otto von Habsburg is going to do it in his voice. Wer nicht weiß, woher er kommt, weiß nicht, wohin er geht, weil er nicht weiß, wo er steht, meine lieben Freunde der Pan-Europa-Union. Which is, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going, because you don't know where you're standing, my dear friends of the Pan-European movement. He always quoted that, which is a strong call to knowing your roots and your tradition. The other thing he said, there was always levity. It was never serious. There was a lot of smile in the way he talked. And for instance, one of the things he said was, nicht geschossen ist auch gefehlt. If you don't shoot, you lose in any kind. You always miss if you don't shoot. So it's a strong encouragement by him to go out there, engage yourself in politics, in whatever, and don't be afraid of making a mistake, because if you don't do anything, you lose in any case. A very strong voice in our lives. And of course the most important, Pan-Europa ist ganz Europa. I knew that by heart, that line. Pan-Europa ist ganz, which of course in a literal sense means, pan is Greek and means all. So, but for us, I have to explain, I'm a son of a Hungarian immigrant. My father as a child fled the Russian troops with his family, arrived in Western Europe, and I grew up in Germany as a child. So I saw the Iron Curtain from the other side. And for all of us, it was clear that this curtain and the Warsaw Pact would always be there. It was clear. Everybody knew that. Even the church, the Catholic Church, had the feeling that they had to negotiate because it would sort of always be there. And Otto, from the beginning, as we have heard before, he put a chair into the European Parliament to say, no, a part of Europe that is behind the curtain not only belongs to Europe, but will be part of Europe. He predicted very early that the communist system won't survive. It was unthinkable to us, but because he said it, we believed it. We believed in the idea of a greater Europe. And I remember the 1979 elections. I remember we helped. We were at his talks. We saw this pan-European flag. And when he made it into parliament, we were all incredibly proud of him. And he was, as I told you, you have to know your roots. But he knew how to step into the 20th century. He could have spent his time playing the heir to the Austrian throne. There were a lot of people who wanted to celebrate him as a potential emperor one day. And you can spend a lot of years doing that. But he said, no. I take the principles of the Habsburg family and I transport them into our time. And this, for him, meant fighting for Europe and for a unified Europe. So we grew up with the idea of Europe being the most important project of the 20th century. And rightly so it was. And yes, so I always was certain that the Iron Curtain would always be there, but Otto once took me aside and we talked about this. He said, You know, my dear, the Iron Curtain is like a lady's stocking. If there is one little hole somewhere, it will go down all the way and in the end it's all torn. I remember that line. I said, that's incredible. I said, can't be true. And then funnily enough, this is how history goes in circles. Funnily enough, in 1989, on the 19th of August, the Pan-Europa Union organized the so-called Sopron Pan-Europa picnic. For those of you who perhaps don't know what it was a picnic on the Hungarian-Austrian border. The two states had agreed to open the gate on that very green border there for a few hours so that pan-Europeans from Hungary and from Austria could celebrate together. And when that was being planned, and it was planned by Otto von Habsburg, there were those huge amounts of Eastern German refugees in Budapest, in the order of Malta parishes, in the German embassy, everywhere. And the Pan-European movement began handing out flyers about this Pan-European picnic that will take place on the 19th at that and that point on the border. So when they opened the gate and we were there, hundreds of Eastern European refugees waited at the border. And this was really the moment where the first little hole in the Iron Curtain appeared. And Otto von Habsburg had helped bring it about. It's incredible. And I happened to be there, a young, stupid student, and not understanding the moment in history. I was just, what's going on there? Wow, look at all those refugees. And I remember we talked to the Hungarian border guard. And he said to me, you know, I saw those hundreds and hundreds of people. I had two choices. I could shoot, or I could open the gate and look in the other direction. And he opened the gate. So that was also brought about with Otto von Habsburg's help. Yes. I remember that, as we heard before, he had a Hungarian heart. I will tell you a secret. Ambassador Urkuti told you that his heart is buried in Hungary, Pannonhalma. He actually wanted all his body to be buried in Pannonhalma. He loved Hungary that much. He was raised by Hungarian priests in his faith. And I know, for instance, that when he was old and in bed and in his last illness before he died, he returned to saying all his prayers in Hungarian, the rosary in Hungarian. All his personal devotion was in Hungarian because he had learned in Hungarian. So I always knew he wanted to be buried wholeheartedly in Hungary and not in the Kapuciner Grove. But we can't do that. The Habsburgs have to be buried in the Kapuciner Grove. So he said, okay, but my heart lies buried in Hungary. Yes. So if you look at us today, Hungary has embraced its Habsburg heritage strongly. There are two Habsburg ambassadors that work for Hungary. One is me at the Holy See Vatican. One is my cousin George, Otto's son, who is ambassador to Paris. And I think the reason why Hungary could embrace the Habsburg past, and it wasn't always easy for Hungary. Habsburgs were seen as oppressors. Habsburg was seen as the enemy for a long time, was because of this incredible character of Otto, who is still today very popular in our country. And I hope that I gave you a little idea of his character, of his style of speaking, and what it did to us to grow up under Otto von Habsburg. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited to speak at this seminar, I wasn't exactly sure what I would talk about. So my question was, what is the connection between Otto von Habsburg and Latvia? And who should I ask the question? Clearly in this modern day and age, I should ask artificial intelligence. So I went to Google's artificial intelligence, Gemini, and I got this answer.
Oh, wow.
There is no direct historical connection between Otto von Habsburg and Latvia. However, Otto von Habsburg was a prominent European figure who advocated for the unification of Europe and the rights of nations, including those under Soviet occupation. This indirectly relates to Latvia, which was occupied by the Soviet Union from 1940 to 1991. Habsburg's support for the self-determination of nations and his opposition to Soviet imperialism may have resonated with some Latvians who were fighting for independence. However, there is no specific record of him actively supporting the Latvian cause. So I gave up on artificial intelligence and I decided to try another modern tool, which is the digitised periodicals in the National Library of Latvia. This is a collection which is improving all the time. It includes Latvian periodicals worldwide. It also includes Russian language periodicals and also German language periodicals which are published in Latvia. So what I did first of all was to search for Habsburgs, including all inflections. In Latvian language, the words are inflected, so Habsburgs, Habsburga, Habsburgam, Habsburga, Habsburgi, and so on. And I found 5,751 results. Interestingly enough, there's a very common misspelling, which is Habsburgs with a P. So looking at this, we found 34 results. Okay, but Habsburgs is a very, very wide topic. We only want Otto. So looking at all of the combinations, I searched for Habsburgs or the one with the P. With Otto or Otto, in Latvian, in modern day Latvian, Otto must be spelled with a single T, which is a sore point with some people. And what I did was to find 1,153 results. Looking at these chronologically, so you've got a graph there by decades. The oldest ones are down the bottom, newest ones right up the top. This will not necessarily include all occurrences because it's analysed by optical character recognition, which is not 100% accurate, and it will include some spurious results with Otto somewhere, Habsburg somewhere in a different article in the same publication. Anyway, so you can see that going from the older ones in the bottom, there's a huge number of publications, well, relatively huge number of publications in the 1930s, where he was a hot topic of conversation. Afterwards, it had died down a bit, but it was still there. And again, in the 1980s, there was quite a few publications, and also the early 2000s. So the oldest one I want to look at is newspaper Latvis in 1926, which bills itself as a non-partisan national newspaper. And here we have the front page of Latvis. Right at the top, there's a photograph in the middle of a very young Otto von Habsburg. Pretender to the Hungarian throne, Habsburg Prince Otto, minor son of the late Austro-Hungarian Emperor Charles and his widow Zita. There's no article to go with it, it's just a photograph by itself on the front page, between a photograph on the left, or a caricature on the left referring to the budget, and a photograph of school children in Chile demonstrating about some water question. Going a bit later, in 1934, a newspaper called Rīts, or The Morning. Again, this has just got a photograph with no article to go with it. The photograph down the bottom is the Archduke Eugen Habsburg, in gratitude for Otto Habsburg being elected as an honorary citizen of Eisenstadt, places a wreath at the Soldiers' Memorial in Eisenstadt. So, both fairly positive mentions of him. If we go a bit further on, 1934, Latvian Socialist Press, Strādnieku avīze, the workers' paper. This is actually an interesting edition. It's the 16th of May 1934, and you might recall that the putsch in Latvia, Ulmanis coup d'etat, was in 15th of May 1934. So this would have been put together just before his putsch, and this is in fact the very last edition of this newspaper. It was closed afterwards. So in this edition, there's an article mentioning the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs discuss returning to Austria. Dollfuss prepares the way for them. Archduke Otto Habsburg, who lives with his mother, ex-Empress Zita in Belgium, arrived in Basel on Saturday, as it has now become known, to visit Archduke Eugen. Otto Habsburg will discuss with him the political situation in Austria and the possibility of the ex-emperor's family returning to Vienna. Archduke Eugen is known to have recently received permission to live in Austria again. It's a socialist newspaper. It's Latvian Social Democrats. The motto right at the top, above the title Strutting Obvious, is "Workers of the World Unite." So it's the right philosophy, but they seem apparently have no problem with him. There's also, oh, did I press the wrong button? I must have pressed the wrong button. There's also exiled Latvian socialist press in the United States from 1934. These are people who left after the 1905 revolution or in the 19th century revolution. So there's an active socialist press in the United States. Newspaper Strādnieku Rīts, the Workers' Morning, and it's just got a short item which says, Paris, the semi-official newspaper Le Temps warns Austria against the restoration of the Habsburg dynasty through the projected enthronement of Prince Otto. Heimwehrskommandant Starhemberg's trip to Rome is explained as seeking a blessing for Otto's ascension to the throne. So that is a bit of a negative thing. Starhemberg is actually a very interesting character, but we won't talk about him now. If we go on a bit, Latvian press in 1936, it reads again, morning. There's an article by L. Niemanovs, Vienna, storm clouds in Central Europe. Will the restoration of the Habsburgs save Austria's independence? It should be noted that there is also a very strong restoration movement in Austria. Together with the conclusion of the July 11 Treaty, there are more and more people who would like to see the Habsburg dynasty on the throne again. In Austria, of course, without talking about the great Germans and National Socialists, the idea that the restoration of the Habsburg dynasty is the only thing that could save Austria's independence and ward off the National Socialists who aspire to seize state power is taking root more and more. This belief is held not only by Christian socialists, but also by liberals, Democrats, and even the remaining socialist leaders in Austria. The vast majority of the peasantry is legitimised by tradition and religious motives. Austrian peasants proved their loyalty to the Habsburgs by the fact that more than 1,000 peasant municipalities elected Archduke Otto as their honorary citizen. So a very positive article, one might say. This is after the July 11 treaty between Austria and Germany, the Abkommen, and a couple of years before Anschluss. So it's completely misconstrues the future. Not only did Otto not return as the emperor, but Austria did not keep its independence. After the war, you can divide the Latvian press into two very separate things, the Soviet Latvian press and the exile Latvian press. The Soviet Latvian press has very few articles which mention Otto von Habsburg. One of them is an article in Cīņa, The Struggle, which is the main daily newspaper in Latvia. An article called On the Crossroads by the European Parliament. It's by the economist O. Potrecki, an interesting character. He became one of the leaders of the Latvian Communist Party, and in independent Latvia sometime later he was also sentenced for fraud. Anyway, what he writes is really quite vitriolic. Under these conditions, the door to the Parliament opens to right-wing actors of all ranks, but is restricted or practically closed to parliamentary candidates from communist and other democratic parties. By the way, the former Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, W. Brandt, describing the candidate for the European Parliament, Otto von Habsburg, the son of the last Austrian emperor, said, "Such a personality should not be allowed in German politics, and even more so in Strasbourg. The emperor's successor proclaims the advantages of one-man dictatorship in extreme political conditions." And as you can see, the diagram in the newspaper is the structure of the European Parliament. You may ask why suddenly this article appears. It's usually damning Otto von Habsburg in the Parliament. But if you look at an article in this Australian Latvian, 2 days later, it's an article for a free and united Europe. And That's the front page. The actual article continues inside. And it is about the Pan-European Union Congress, which took place on May the 12th. So shortly before that nasty article by Potrecki. And it says, the final speech was delivered by the President of the Pan-European Union, the candidate of the German Christian Social Union for the European Parliament, Otto von Habsburg, highlighting the decisive importance of the European Parliament, which will express the solidarity of all Europeans. Habsburg also reminded that a united Europe should include all European nations and that the territory of Europe does not end at the borders drawn in 1945. In all international forums, there must be talk not only about decolonisation in Asia and Africa, but also about the liberation of the peoples of Eastern Europe. The highest duty of all Christians, Habsburg said, is to protect Europe from Marxist socialism and transform it into a continent of social justice and democratic freedom. So I think you can understand the response in the Soviet press soon afterwards. Jumping forwards a few years to events which have been mentioned today also. If we look at, Exile Latvian Press 1983, London's Avīze, London newspaper, with the headline, "The Baltic Resolution must be moved forward, Dr. Otto von Habsburg's suggestions." And there's a number of points in this. The question of the Baltic States should be raised in the United Nations, and it should be proposed as early as September of this year, said Otto von Habsburg, meeting with representatives of the Baltic American Liberty League at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, California. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss the prospect of the resolution adopted in the European Parliament and what should be done next. The consciences of the countries must be awakened that the United Nations should respect all issues of decolonisation. Ignoring the issue of decolonisation in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania is unacceptable for the Baltics. These were some of Dr. Habsburg's recommendations. To the question of the president of the Baltic American Freedom League, Valdis Pavlovskis, when to start this action, the answer was immediately. Dr. Habsburg said that he would speak on this issue at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council on the same day. And interesting enough, the final point, finally, the former property of the Latvian embassy in the English sector of Berlin, which R. Schilder is working on, was also touched. Dr. Otto von Habsburg also mentioned it as one of his future fields of work, so not interested only in the big picture, but also in details like this. So it's the front page of the London newspaper, and the photograph that you can see is Dr. Otto von Habsburg among officers of the Baltic American Freedom League. From the left, Estonians Avi Pirisild, Vivi Pirisild, Dr. Otto von Habsburg, the president of the league, Valdis Pavlovskis, Lithuania Antonis Mazeika. So continuing on with the theme of the European Parliament. So, large and small debates in the European Parliament in Strasbourg about the Baltic States. In March of this year, Otto von Habsburg, member of the German faction of the European Parliament, asked the foreign ministers of the European Union what they were doing to implement the resolution adopted on January 13 of this year. Otto von Habsburg's question was as follows: what have the foreign ministers done in connection with the call given to them by the parliamentary session to raise the question of the Baltic States in the United Nations Subcommittee on Decolonisation? And if nothing has already been done, when do they intend to approach this problem in accordance with the parliamentary demand? I've left out a bit where Genscher essentially says, well, better not to do it because if there's a negative result, then it'll be bad for the Baltic States. And Otto von Habsburg, who had asked the question in English, switched to German in his comments to Foreign Minister Genscher's answer, saying, "I must honestly say that this answer made me deeply disappointed. You directly deal personally with the issue of decolonisation in different parts of the world. That the little ones have to suffer because they are not to be feared, and nothing is done against the big ones because there's no hope of achieving anything, is a contempt for the moral principles that laid the basis of colonisation. Don't you think it would be better for Europe to follow a certain line here?" So very, very clear principles, very clear philosophy, what is right and what should be done. So returning to the Soviet Latvian press, newspaper Padomju Jaunatne, Soviet Youth, again one of the big dailies in Latvia. The headline, A Parliament of Gestures and Ambitions. Several resolutions have been adopted in the European Parliament which can be regarded as anti-Soviet outbursts. Among them are lurid fictions about the illegal inclusion of the Baltic Soviet republics into the USSR. One of the most active members of the European Parliament, Otto von Habsburg, scion of the Austro-Hungarian monarch dynasty, is a heartfelt friend of the Baltic reactionary immigrants. These facts of activity in the European Parliament can be counted among futile efforts related to illusions. So, moving on. Soviet Latvian press 1 year later. This is a very large article in Dzimtenes balss, the Voice of the Homeland, which is a newspaper intended for overseas Latvians, exile Latvians, emigre Latvians, whatever you call them at that time. Essentially the history of Latvia and how Latvians really wanted to join the Soviet Union and things like that by two very well-known people, Chesbers and Neilands. The Baltic card in the political game of imperialism. And just taking one paragraph out of this. Some eternal nostalgics of Western Europe are also trying to assert themselves in this anti-Soviet ruckus. Following, for the Latvians it was Jandalinch in Latvian. Following the overseas activists, the former French Foreign Minister Socialist K. Sesson, and even the odious descendant of the Habsburg dynasty, the member of the European Parliament, Otto Habsburg, have started talking about the non-recognition of the Soviet Baltics. On his initiative, the issue of the legality of the unification of the Soviet Baltic republics and the USSR was discussed at the Strasbourg Parliament sessions. What is there to say? Only a person who has completely lost his sense of humour can make such interpolations. We have to ask, what does the Parliament of the EEA countries, established in the mid-70s, have to do with the Soviet Baltics? So, moving on to happier times, 1996, the Latvian press. It's an article with the heading, which is a bit critical of the European Union, or the European Parliament, specify the obligatory curvature of a banana. Everything should be considered and weighed before knocking at the doors of the European Union. So, not taking into account the 160 death sentences and 53 executions in Russia in 1994, not taking into account Russia's not joining the International Human Rights Convention, not taking into account the aggressive and people-destroying war in Chechnya, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe made a decision on January 25, Russia may be admitted to the Council of Europe. Pan-European President Dr. Otto von Habsburg called this decision the biggest political mistake. However, this did not stop the EP Committee of Ministers from taking the final decision on the admission of Russia to the EP on February the 8th. And just as a small postscript, the Russian Federation was suspended from the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in February 2022, so Otto von Habsburg was right all along. He's also mentioned in Latvian press afterwards, but I think we'll stop there. I think this is the most interesting ones.
So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank you to the Embassy of Hungary here in Riga, and especially my friend Ambassador György Urkuti for the cordial invitation to this international conference. Thank you for having me today. President Luiz, Archbishop Stankovic, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 100 million people, 100 million victims, executed, tortured, shattered, displaced, physically and spiritually crippled. The lie of communists has claimed hundreds of millions of lives over 70 years, while masking its true nature with sublime goals and a noble vision. Like it despised and ostracized little brother, National Socialism, it made the stigmatization, exclusion, even torture and murder of its fellow human beings a legitimate and commonplace practice. Communists demanded exclusivity, offering a new identity, a new type of man, Homo Sovieticus, and presented itself as the depository of the one true and unquestionable faith. This is why God and faith were denied and why believers were persecuted. Let it be said, communism was a religion. It had a Bible, Marx, Das Kapital. Its sacred text, the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, Stalin. Its catechism, the Communist Manifesto. Like the Bible, the Marxist historical narrative is a redemption story. Why? With capitalism as its cardinal sin. He believed in salvation and paradise, like the religious. The only difference was that it was already promised the common earth. It brings back religions from heaven to earth. The British communist Ernest Balfour Bax promised the Lord as early as the 19th century. But those who refused to believed faced, at best, literal cold exile, oppression, or, at worst, death. These are the cold, hard facts. So cold, we don't even want to understand them. Let me put it in a different way, as I would try to explain it to my 6 and 8 years old daughters. Now, imagine, girls, that a friendly stranger walks into our home. He kindly leads down and tells you that he knows the way to fairyland. And there, in fairyland, far, far away, he says, no one is sick or sad. Everyone is happy, and everyone gets what he wants. He speaks so beautifully of this fairyland that you want to join him. The journey will not be easy. Of course, he prepares you, for nothing is possible without sacrifice. First, he asks you to give him your toys, so that others can play with them too. You will also have to give up your nursery and your sleeping room, because that would remind you of the evil old world. And, of course, of me and Mom, who the stranger says will not want to let you go, because they are selfish and possessive. You say timidly that you love your daddy and your mommy, and that you want to take them with you, but the stranger, less gently at this point, looks you deep in the eye and said, they are the past and we are heading to the future. Since you are so eager to go to fairyland, and you remember that we actually scolded you a few times for this or that, you end up going with him. Along the way, you notice that your school friends are also persuaded by the strangers to come along, either disappear or act oddly. Slowly, you understand that some of them have been instructed to watch you, even report on you, because the stranger doesn't really trust you. The atmosphere is so bad, and the journey is terribly exhausting. By this time, you miss us, as well as your toys and your room. You want to turn back, but by then you are surrounded by more strangers who are already shouting at you. They claim you want to sell the dream. You don't want fairyland so much that you are not their friends, you are the enemies, and you are the very cause of the long and tiring journey. If you are lucky, you can escape under the cover of the night. If not, you will be locked up somewhere. For you have betrayed fairyland. But you girls can escape, and now that you know the stranger has deceived you, you want to tell everyone what has happened. That is when you will be most disappointed, because the strangers will spread the word that you are bad and you are liars, that nothing you say is true, and that those like you have no place in the world because you are hindering the great dream. Well, girls, this is the terrifying tale of communism. Ladies and gentlemen, the worst part of this that is actually happened. Our fellow human beings were murdered for a false vision of the perfect future. Millions of them in Hannah Arendt's words, in an administrative massacre, while the whole world was being assured that communism was the best of all worlds. From the first moment to the last, however, the Soviet model, as it was implemented, was a total dictatorship. From the very beginning, it has shown extremely repulsive features that are completely contradictory to its stated aims, the ideal. Instead of abundance, it has created a shortage of goods. Instead of equality, it has doubled the distribution of rations to party cadres and created a new ruling class, the elite. Instead of fraternity, it has established a system of suspicion and generalized infiltration. Instead of freedom, it has woven a cobweb of the most basic, the most absurd, the most humiliating constraints over society, which it has kept in fear by means of the most ruthless terror. It knew no moderation, for its nature was born of the seed of human evil. That is why, from the very first moment, it used violence against its perceived or real enemies on a previously unknown scale. The inexhaustible class hatred, the logic of with me or against me, the disregard of moral laws, the cynical, inhuman behavior have resulted in the death of hundreds of millions of people. The exile from human existence, the torture, the starvation, the slave labor, the death by torture are the same in Reich as in Dachau, and Kolyma is no different from Mauthausen in this respect. Both the Gulag and the Nazi camp network were created for the same objective, and the millions of victims testify that they served their purpose. Writes Imre Kertész, Nobel Prize-winning Hungarian writer and Holocaust survivor. Both communist dictatorships not only committed unforgivable crimes against those they considered to be enemies, but also against themselves and their comrades, as they turned everyone, including themselves, into betrayers, collaborators, insurgers, clappers, deaf, dumb, and blind. The system of communist terror was based on exclusivity and unification, which politicized all walks of life. One idea, one ideology, one culture, one policy, one party, one leader, one family, one central of control. The communists abolished private property and constantly attempted to suppress private sphere altogether. The people, deprived and denied of responsible decisions, were gathered in the mass party, they were mass cultured and degraded into mass people. Their traditional ties were cut, their traditions were eradicated. In a society that's atomized, there was no shelter left for the ruthless individuals who were vulnerable to manipulation. They had to settle for the utopia of realized socialism that we Hungarians had to spend more than 4 decades building. Orwell's dystopia has now turned into reality. Oddly enough, the ones who fell for this lie the most were those who had no first-hand experience of it, because they lived beyond the Iron Curtain in safety, prosperity, and more importantly, in freedom. As Hungarian-born sociologist Paul Hollander, who experienced the Nazi Eurocross rampage at the age of 12 and then left his country after the 1956 revolution, put it as follows: the attitudes I encountered and still do, both in England and in the United States, ranged from stunning ignorance to ambivalence, wishful thinking, and outright sympathy. We can't get away with confronting the crimes of communism. We owe it to the hundreds of millions of victims, but we also owe it to our children. The difference between traditional and modern political lies essentially amounts to the difference between concealment and annihilation, wrote Hannah Arendt in her essay collection entitled Between Past and Future, published in 1961. It is no exaggeration to say that we, Central and Eastern Europeans, are left alone with the memory of communism. Here, in the central and east of Europe, we know the two types of modern, in other words, destructive lies. The first one was the promise of communism itself, which concealed its true nature with a noble vision for the future. The other modern lie, however, is unfortunately not for the past, but the reality of our present. Because, while in the Western world, Nazism was, quite rightly, thrown to the stinking dump of history, both morally and intellectually, yet the debate on communist system and its ideological nature is not finished. On the contrary, it was, and it still is, a legitimate ideology. The discussion of the inhuman crimes of communists falls on deaf ears and meets cold interest, disinterest in Western intellectual communities. Lenin's useful idiots have displayed and continue to display a staggering pseudo-ignorance of the true face of communism and show almost unconditional sympathy for one of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century. Even though more than 3 decades have passed since the fall of communism and the regime change, we can declare that communism is not dead. Western representatives are to be found on university campuses, at institutions, in the media, and in politics. And the West, partly for this reason, still shrugs its shoulders as an indifferent outsider when we talk about the crimes and the misery caused by communism. For decades, Western leaders, parliamentarians, orators, publicists, writers, and opinion makers have been able to turn a blind eye to the 15 million people of the Gulag, said Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who has done more than many others to help the world discover the true nature of communism. Solzhenitsyn's words were spoken 50 years ago, but the Western world still can't help squirming in its chair and looking spectacularly bored when we refer to our experiences under communism or when we form our opinions based on our knowledge and experience under the communist dictatorships. The blatant crimes of communists leave them unmoved. Jean-Claude Juncker, president of the European Commission, armed with the statue of Karl Marx with Chinese money, and in his speech he excused Marx by saying that he was not responsible for the crimes committed by those who claimed to be his and followers. Also, in Brussels, the leader of the European Greek Party could quote Lenin in the European Parliament without any consequences. Just as in Strasbourg in October, communist MPs could sing Bella Ciao without any retaliation against the Prime Minister who demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops from our region back in 1989. This is a red flag. We may learn from it that freedom does not protect us from foolishness. In short, those who are free often forget what is it like to live without freedom. We, in Central and Eastern Europe, regained our freedom and independence more than 30 years ago. We paid a great price for it. Ladies and gentlemen, dictatorships should and must be analyzed from a historical point of view. We need to understand their essence, we need to make their nature clear, we need to know why and how they came into existence. This is what the House of Terror Museum in Budapest and many others are doing all over the world, including you here in Latvia. Because communism and Nazism are like a deadly virus. To defeat and control it, we must learn about it, analyze it, isolate it, and then develop the antidote that will make us immune against it. Once it has been deactivated, we can lock it up in museums and demonstrate to future generations that it is the deadly disease we do not want to see returned to our lives. When Prime Minister Viktor Orbán opened the House of Terror Museum on 24th of February 2002, he said the following, quote starts, "We don't need museums like this to offer our children a personal experience of fear, terror, humiliation. We don't need these museums to make them tremble. We want our children to grow up in Hungary knowing what those who came before them have endured. We want our children to realize that freedom is not given for free. We want our children to know that the world in which we lived has been made a better place at the cost of hard struggle and great suffering. We want them never to forget that someone has already credited them for the future. We want them to realize that peace, security, freedom and prosperity are not a self-evident right, but the hard-earned achievements of successive generations. We want it to be clear to our children that only citizens of a nation who are able to fight for their own dignity, if necessary, can be free. Quote that. We, in the House of Terror Museum, have put these two dictatorships alongside each other because they fit nicely next to one another. As Imre Kertész put it, one appears as a savior and under his robe hides the devil. The other disguises himself as Satan and is in fact Satan. But those who try to divide the two dictatorships, those who want to distinguish between them on the basis of undertone, mathematics or logistics, how many people died or were impoverished, how many lost their families, their houses, their land, their jobs, whether they were sent to certain death by train, by truck or on foot, are the ones who speak of dictatorships in a false way. They are the very reason why we did not and could not enforce historical justice against the communist criminals, because the world lacked the courage and integrity to end the era of socialism by exposing and condemning its crimes. Decades ago, a Hungarian Jewish-born Serbian Montenegrin writer Danilo Kish pointed out that there is only one test of consciousness and only two subjects that one can fail for life. And the two subjects are Nazism and communism. Anyone who fails these two subjects is deprived of the moral right to vote once and for all. Whoever claims that Kolyma was different from Auschwitz, you summed up to 100 devils, he concluded. Ladies and gentlemen, we in Central and Eastern Europe have a great deal of work and a heavy responsibility to make this clear, to explain and make it understood, to those who have not experienced all the horror and misery that we have, to those who did not experience the deadly embrace of communism, to those who are tempted by false promises, the siren voices and the pledge of heaven on earth. We must open their eyes. We still remember. We still know the price of freedom. We remember what sacrifices communism demanded from us. We remember the taste of lies in our mouths. We are bound by these memories and the knowledge we have gained from them. We are bound to honor our heroes. The lads of Pest in 1956, who not only risked their most precious treasure, their lives, with their revolution and their fight for freedom, but also unveiled the Frankenstein monster of communism. To the millions of Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians who formed a 600-kilometer chain on the 23rd of August to prospect against the dictatorship. To the Germans who, on 9th of November, tore down the Berlin Wall, a cruel symbol of the division of the world. To those who overthrew the bloody dictatorship of Ceausescu, and the list goes on. But we are also obliged to salute the victims. We are obliged to remember and to remind. And it obliges us to mourn those who from whom paying the last honors have been denied, whose names have been deliberately erased from our memory, those buried in unmarked graves. We must remember them, so that their sacrifice is not wasted and it may serve as a warning sign. But if we, the descendants, do not try to assess our losses, if we do not strive with all our efforts to give a name to the millions of the perished, so that their fate, merged in the common history of our national community, may serve as an enlightenment for all of us, then we will not be fulfilling our duty. When Otto von Habsburg visited the House of Terror Museum in 2003, he wrote the following line in our guest book. The one who does not know where he comes from may not know where he is going, because he is not even sure where he is. His words may be more valid today than ever before. We, who have endured both total dictatorships, know where we come from. 35 years ago, we made decisions about our own destiny accordingly. We knew where we were going. We wanted to be free and independent, and we proved that nation is more important than class. But that also comes with huge responsibilities in a Europe whose western half does not know the price and meaning of freedom, does not understand the true face of dictatorships, and does not value its national heritage and identity. It appears that they believed the tale of communism. But we, who no longer believe in fairy tales, must take the advice of Arthur Koestler and pull out the candles of truth. Thank you for your attention.